Welcome back, everyone, to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week we're zocha to complete Sefer Shemot by reading Parshas Pekudei, and I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity by looking back on Sefer Shemot. Obviously, not every Parsha; we don't have time for that. But I want to return to the introduction of the Ramban that we read together many months ago when we began Sefer Shemot, where he talks about Sefer Shemot as a Sefer Geula. And on its face, obviously, it is a Sefer Geula, right? We're redeemed from Mitzrayim. But if you think about it, that's Shemot, Va'era, Bo, and half of Bishalach. And then, Kriyas Yamsuf, and we sing the Shira. But what about the end? What about the second half of Sefer Shemot? The second half of Bishalach, and Yitra, and Mishpatim, and Truma, and Tetzav, and Kisisa, and Vayakal, and Pekudei. And so the Ramban there says, and it's fascinating, but I think we can have a deeper insight into it when we read it now. Says the Ramban. First of all, he says the Torah repeats some things at the beginning of the Sefer to make it a complete book. V'nei hagalut einenu nishlam ad yom shuvam el mikomam ve'el ma'alat avotam yashuvu. Says the Ramban, the Geula is not complete. Now we would think, and on some level, it's true. We would think the Geula is not complete until we come into Eretz Yisrael. Now, it could be that the Ramban agrees with that, but we don't come into Eretz Yisrael, not in Shmos, not in Vayikra, not in Bamidbar, not in Devarim. We don't come into until Sefer Yoshua. But I think the Ramban really means it. The end of the Geula, says the Ramban, is when we return to the level of the Avot. Ukishiyatsu miMitzrayim, afal pi sheyatsu mibeit avadim. Right, even though the half of the Geula happened, we left Egypt. Adayin yechashvu golim ki hayu be'eretz lo lahem nevuchim bamidbar. Right, we left Mitzrayim, great, and now we're 2 million people wandering around the desert with no food and no water, and it's a difficult time. Ukishabo el har Sinai va'asu hamishkan v'shav hakadosh baruch hu v'hishra shchinato beinehem. But when we finally build the Mishkan and HaKadosh Baruch Hu returns to us to live amongst us, az shavu el ma'alat avotam. Then and only then did we return to the status of the avot of our forefathers. Shehayasod eloka alei ahalehem. It's a pasuk from Eov, but it's a pasuk the Ramban uses all the time to talk about God living amongst us. And a phrase the Ramban uses very, very often, V'heim heim hamerkava. Literally, we are carrying God's name in this world. Va'az nechshavu geulim. And then we are actually redeemed. V'lachein nishlam hasefer b'hashlimo inyan hamishkan. Therefore, Sefer Shemot ends with the completion of the Mishkan. Ubiyot kvod Hashem maleo totamid. And by God filling the Mishkan with His glory all the time. And when you come to the end of Parshas Pekudei, and you read the Psukim, Vayichase Hanan et Ol Moed, Uchvod Adonai Maleh et HaMishkan, V'lo Yachol Moshe Lavo El Ol Moed, Ki Shachan Alav Ha'anan, Uchvod Adonai Maleh et HaMishkan, Uvehe'alot Ha'anan Me'al HaMishkan, Yisu B'nei Yisrael B'chol Ma'aseihem, V'im Lo Ya'aleh Aleh Ha'anan, V'lo Yisu Ad Yom Ha'alato. Last pasuk. Ki anan Adonai al hamishkan yomam ve'esh ti'alai bo le'inei chol beit Yisrael b'chol ma'aseihem. It fills us with like a feeling of joy and feeling of hope. The Ramban says that's the end of the Geula. Yes, there's more, but Sefer Shemot begins with the names of the Yordei Mitzrayim who are about to go into Galut, and Sefer Shemot ends with Uchvod Hashem Oleh et HaMishkan. Right? And I think it's not just the spiritual level. Again, the Ramban explains the Mishkan as being a traveling Ma'amad Har Sinai. If we ask ourselves, what's the high point? What's the spiritual high point of Sefer Shemot? So if we say, what's the narrative high point, we'd probably say, Yetziat Mitzrayim. But the moment, the spiritual pinnacle of Sefer Shemot is Ma'amad Har Sinai. And that we get to duplicate at any and all times that we go to the Mishkan and that we feel God's presence, and there's a Hashrat HaShechinah. And God has now created for us a way of recreating this spiritual high of Sefer Shemot. And it really is, it's not just a literary trick that the Ramban wants to find a theme of every Sefer, and he finds the Gula as the theme of Sefer Shemot. It's the same exact thing when in Sefer Breshit, when he talks about the role and the modeling of Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim. So he says it's the Sefer Yetzirah. Okay, that's obviously Parshat Breshit. And maybe that's the end of Parshat Noach after the Mabul. But what's with the rest of the Sefer? And he says, no. Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim. It's Maaseh Avot Yetzirah Labanim. Right? All of Sefer Breshit is foreshadowing. It's really a stronger word than that. It's creating a historical path for Am Yisrael. The historical path that's then followed in Sefer Shemot. And the high point of Sefer Shemot is not really Yetziat Mitzrayim, but it's the building of the Mishkan. And even, for the Ramban, where the Mishkan was lechatchila, it did not come originally as a tikkun of Chet HaEgel. God gave it to Moshe on Har Sinai before there was a Chet HaEgel, before anything terrible ever happened to Am Yisrael, or before we ever did something terrible. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Mishkan because we needed it. Because the whole point of Ma'amad Har Sinai was to create within us a desire for God's presence, or almost a physical desire for God's presence, and God had to address that. Now, it turns out, before God was able to address it, we failed and we sinned with Chet HaEgel because, the Ramban will explain, or did explain, because of the desire that was created at Ma'amad Har Sinai, because the physical interaction with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, seeing and feeling His presence, created within us a desire for that to continue. But even without it, so let's say there would not have been the bulk of Pashas Kitisa, which is the description of the Chet HaEgel. But for the Ramban, it still would have been, you come down from Har Sinai with the Luchot, and you build a Mishkan. So maybe, Vayaka Pekudei wouldn't have had to exist because Truma and Tetzava would have been enough. But the bottom line, it says the Ramban, the plan always was Yitziat Mitzrayim, the giving of the Torah, and not really, the Torah didn't matter as much as the Hashrat HaShchina, the Gilui Shchina on Har Sinai, followed immediately by the building of the Mishkan. That was what Sefer Shemot was supposed to be, the Galut, the Geula, beginning with Yitziat Mitzrayim, continuing on Har Sinai, but finishing with the permanent Hashrat HaShchina v'Kadosh Baruch Hu, with Ki Anan Hashem ala Mishkan Yomam ve'esh ti alayla labo le'nei kol Beit Yisrael b'chol ma'asehem. That was always the plan, and that's how Sefer Shemot played out. Again, with the interruption of the Chet HaEgel, which wasn't supposed to be there, and is covered in Kitisa, and then is followed by Vayakel Pekudei, more or less the same thing as Truma Tetzava. Okay, so that's the brief recap and the summary of Sefer Shemot for the Ramban, and it turns out that his description in the introduction to Sefer Shemot is spot on, and it's exactly what we experience as we read Sefer Shemot. Okay, two quick Rambans actually on Parshas Pekudei. The first is towards the very beginning of the Parsha, Perek Lamed Ches, says the Torah in Pasuk Chaf Bet. Here we go. Uvitzalel, first, Eila Pekudei Mishkan Aidut, it's the very beginning of the Parsha, Asher Pukad Al Pi Moshe, Avodat Alvim Biyadi Tama Ben Aaron HaKohen. And then you have a strange pasuk. Uvitzalel ben Uri ben Chur leMatei Yehuda, Asa Eit Kol Asher Tziva Adonai et Moshe. Okay, on some level, obviously Bitzalel did whatever Moshe Rabbeinu told him to do. But did Bitzalel do all the work? What about all the Chacham Lev? What about all the donors? What about all the people, Hashem Nisa'o Libam, to build things? It's way too much for one person to do. So says the Ramban, not surprisingly, on that pasuk, Ha'inyan. Ki al piv na'aseh hakol. Right, Bitzalel didn't do everything. He didn't build everything on his own, but he was in charge of everything, so he gets credit for it. Ki hu hamoreh l'chol hachachamim ulefanav hayu osim kulam. Right? they would come to, how do we build the Zer Zahav Saviv? And Betzalel would tell them, and he would watch them, and they would do it. Umarim melav kol malachtam kimo shamar ulahorot natan bilibo. And immediately afterwards, I don't know how often, they'd come to Betzalel. Like any teacher, they'd say to him, how does this look? How am I doing? Is the box a complete square as it's supposed to be? Is it a complete rectangle as it's supposed to be? What do you think? Aval gam kol chachmei lev asu b'malacha. Obviously, as the pasuk says elsewhere, kol chacham lev b'chem yavo v'yasu eit kol asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe. They obviously did things. Kimo shamar v'yasu kol chacham lev b'oseh malacha et Mishkan. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, the second point is the use of the phrase kashet tzivah Hashem et Moshe. And here, I really have a problem that I haven't been able to sort out, and I don't usually raise issues without having a suggested answer for, but I think it's so obvious. Says the Ramban, Va'aldat rabotenu hiyezel l'shabeach oto. There's an additional praise to Betzalel that maybe we wouldn't notice. V'lomar, sha'afilu dvarim shelo amar lo rabo, hiskima da'ato l'mashe ne'emar l'Moshe misinai. The point of the pasuk kashet tzivah Hashem et Moshe is to make a subtle point. It's a point that Rashi already made by quoting the Medrash, right? The famous Medrash tells us, and really you can't learn the psukim without it. Why is the order of the kelim in Truma and Tetzaveh different than the order of how they actually built the Mishkan? And the famous Medrash says that, okay, God told Moshe this order for Truma and Tetzaveh, but then Betzalel comes to Moshe and says to him, wait, how do you build a house? You don't build the bedrooms first. You don't build the internal, you don't put in the plumbing first. First you have to put up the walls. First you have to build everything outside, and then you work your way in. And he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, that's how we should build the Mishkan. First the krashim and the yiriot and all the outside things, and then the internal things. And then Moshe says to him in the Medrash, maybe that's why they call you Betzalel, because you must have been B'tzel Kel, because that's what God told me. Okay, so that's the Medrash. So the Ramban is referring to that here, where he says, Ela shekiyem b'chol ha'naaseh al yado kol asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, ulefikach lo amar b'chol ha'naaseh ad heina ka'asher diber Hashem el Moshe. It doesn't say in Parshas Vayakel, kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, ki haya b'mashma kasher amar Moshe b'dvar Hashem, because it would have sounded like Betzalel did exactly what God told Moshe, and Moshe commanded him, and that's not true. V'hu shina haseder b'ha mima she'amar lo Moshe, but Betzalel changed the order. Ulefikach klal ze b'kan lomar she'asa hakol kasher amar Hashem. So therefore, it just says here, Kashet Tzivah Hashem et Moshe, to say that Betzalel did what God commanded Moshe, even though it doesn't match up exactly with what Moshe commanded Betzalel. Now, you could say simply that the order of building the Kelim is not very significant. Okay, you build the Aron first, you build the Shulchan first, you build the Menorah first, you build the Mishkan. What's the big difference? And maybe that's the answer to the question I'm about to ask, but I think the obvious question is, how could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu got it wrong? How could it be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, really you're supposed to build the external part of the Mishkan first, and then build the internal part? And Moshe didn't tell that to Betzalel, or he's certainly in the Medrash, right? B'tzel kel ayita, that God told Moshe to build it in order X, and Moshe told Betzalel to build it in order Y. It bothers me, right? Our reliance on Moshe Rabbeinu, who got nevuah ba'aspakla me'ira, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu pe'el pe'adaber bo b'marev lo b'chidot, that he could have gotten something wrong, right? Torah Moshe, the entirety of the Torah, except maybe the first 2 or the 10 or the Aseret Hadibros, we got from Moshe Rabbeinu. the possibility that Moshe gets something wrong, and I use wrong in air quotes because I'm afraid to say it, I don't know if it's true even, what do we do with that? How could that even be a possibility? What's the Medrash referring to? When the Medrash says, B'tzeil kel hayita, you heard what God said and I didn't. Right? What do we do with that? And how do we relate to it? I don't know. Honestly, I'd be happy if somebody wrote to me and gave me a pshat in that, because I think it's a difficulty, and I think it's something that bothers me, and it's something that, until you get an answer, should bother all of us. The thought that Moshe Rabbeinu could have gotten something wrong is generally not something we think is possible, and shouldn't be possible. And so, what's the alternate meaning of the Medrash? Now, again, you could say, as I said a few minutes ago, it doesn't really matter. The order doesn't matter. It's a technicality. But even there, it bothers me a little bit. It should bother us a little bit how to understand that. And the sense that Moshe Rabbeinu, was a Navi, but also was a human who could make mistakes, I don't know if that helps us. I really don't know. So I'm leaving that out there. We generally don't do this, but I'm leaving it out there because I think it's something that we should think about. And I'd be thrilled if somebody wrote to me and explained to me and suggested something that, that I haven't thought of. I didn't look extensively. I looked briefly. I didn't see anybody who addresses this. I'm sure people do. Okay, let's leave it at that. And let's do one more Ramban for Sefer Shemot and for Parshas Pekudei. Okay, so Perek Lamed Tes Pasuk Membet says the Torah, Kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe Kain asu b'nei Yisrael eit kol ha'avodah. The Ramban is interested in why it's called avodah. Doesn't that have a negative connotation? And says the Ramban, Kain asu b'nei Yisrael eit kol ha'avodah. Kol ha'melechet ha'mishkan yikra'ena avodah. So Ramban, it's the exact opposite of what we would think. The entirety of the work of building the Mishkan is called avodah. Lomar, Ki asu ota la'avodat Hashem hanichbad, ki inyan va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem va'oto ta'avodu. Right? When we see the word avodah, we naturally think to ourselves something negative. It's like a servant master thing. You have to do this, you have to do that, you're obligated to do this, you're obligated to do that. Says the Ramban, no, we're looking at it the wrong way. When we see the word avodat Hashem, right? To be an Oved Hashem, va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem, it's a completely different connotation. And I think what the Ramban means here is it's not even a Hechsher mitzvah. Building the Mishkan was a mitzvah itself. It's not like buying Daled Minim. It's like taking a lulav and esrog and adasim and aravos. It is the mitzvah itself. And when you think to yourself, at the end of Sefer Shemot, wow, we spent 4 parshiot just describing the work involved in building the Mishkan, so the Ramban would say, yeah, that's exactly right. Because it's not just building the Mishkan, it's Kain asu b'nei Yisrael eit kol ha'avodah. Our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not just better and more perfect at the Mishkan and with the Hashras HaShechina, even b'nistar, the effort we put into it, right? The commitment we made to HaKadosh Baruch Hu via our labor to build the Mishkan pays dividends in the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes there. But you have to see all the work going into building the Mishkan as being significant. You can't just see it as being, the means. The end is the Hashrat HaShechina. Okay, the means are, I have to build this, I have to build that, I have to nail in this nail, I have to glue in this. No, says the Ramban, that avodah is not regular avodah, that's avodat Hashem. That makes us Ovdei Hashem. It raises us. Just the effort that we put into building the Mishkan is a mitzvah in and of itself. Don't think about it, says the Ramban, as being drudgery and some horrible task that we have to do. Think about it as being what it is. Think about it like it's putting on tzitzis, it's wearing tefillin, it's eating matzah, it's taking daled minim, it's keeping Shabbos. That is as much a part as our avodat Hashem as are other mitzvahs themselves. It's part of Taryag mitzvahs. And therefore it gets the big play that it gets in Sefer Shemot, And therefore, it's as significant as it is. Even though the purpose of the Mishkan, says the Ramban, is the recreation of Maimon Har Sinai, it's slightly different. Because we're recreating Maimon Har Sinai. Of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to come and be Mashra Hishchina on us. But we're doing the months and months of work involved in building the Aron and all the Kalim and the Mishkan and the walls and the coverings. They're our Avodat Hashem. They're like davening. They're not just a means to an end. They're the end itself. And the more that we give of ourselves and the more that we devote ourselves to this Makom HaMikdash, the more God responds to us. And to come back to a slightly controversial point we made a number of weeks ago, on the one hand, for the Ramban, the Mishkan is tzorech gavoa, but obviously it's tzorech hedyot. We have as much, or perhaps even more, of an investment in the Mishkan, and we have more of a desire to meet HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to see Him. And we want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to live amongst us as much or more than He wants to live amongst us. That's a relationship. That, says the Ramban, is the secret of Sefer Shemot. It's our desire for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His desire for us. And if the Mishkan just came down from Shamayim, and I know there's a Gemara that says that that's how Bai Shlishi is, but there are other sources, right? If we're not invested in it, if we're not the donors, if we're not the builders, if it's not the enterprise of all of Am Yisrael and all of Klal Yisrael, something would have been lacking in it. And it's dafka the fact that it's the avodah of all of us. It's dafka the fact that everybody donated, and the people who could, who were nesi'ei libam, who God raised up their hearts, were able to build these things. And the fact that I think Bnei Yisrael came and looked at the Mishkan and said, we did that. It didn't just come down from Shamayim. We spent the last 6 months, give or take, with all our hearts and all our efforts building the Mishkan, and now HaKadosh Baruch Hu lives in it. There's much more of a sense of investment. There's much more of a sense of satisfaction in that than, okay, God should punish me by making me win the lottery. Well, I have to buy a ticket first. But when you win the lottery and you become rich, it's much different than if you build a business and become rich. And lahavdil, that's the Mishkan. And says the Ramban, Kein asu b'nei Yisrael eit kol ha'avodah avodat Hashem va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem b'chol levavchem v'chol nafshechem. It's all of us. It's everything we have. And when we invest in HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a metaphor for our relationship, He invests back in us. And what's true about the Mishkan is true about our avodat Hashem. When we invest in davening, when we invest in mitzvahs, when we prepare, when it matters to us really, the satisfaction comes from that. And I think, it's a beautiful point to end our study of Sefer Shemot together with. The Geula is, yes, it's a Geula from Mitzrayim, that's part of it. But the overall spiritual Geula, the desire to come back to the level of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the desire to be Heim HaMerkava, to carry God's name on us in the world that we live in, the desire for the Jewish people and for Am Yisrael and for Medinat Yisrael to be a Kiddush Hashem, to make God's presence in the world real, all of that can be seen in the Mishkan and in this Ramban. That's it for this week. Yashkar to everybody, and looking forward to next week when we begin a new Sefer. Shabbat Shalom.